Hey everyone, Rose here, and it's time for Retopology. Like I mentioned in the last video, this model is supposed to be VRchat friendly. That means it has to be relatively low poly. Specifically, I'm trying to keep my poly count under 32,000 triangles, so to make sure I'm on the right track, I have scene statistics turned on in the bottom right. For this model, I actually used Retopoflow to retopologize it. That doesn't really change much about the process, it just sped things up a bit. The last time I used it, it was still an alpha, and there were a bunch of minor annoyances I had with it that meant it didn't really speed up my process much. However, those have been fixed in the full release, and I actually really enjoyed using Retopoflow this time. And if you're someone who uses Blender and regularly needs to do some retopology, I definitely recommend trying it out. But enough with a preamble, on to the time-lapse. Before I properly started on the retopology process, I decimated the high poly models and separated them out into separate collections so that they wouldn't cause a bunch of lag or get in my way. From there I started with the face. I used the strokes tool and poly pen to plan out the basic edge loops around the eyes and around the mouth, around the jaw and around the ears. At this point they don't need to have the right poly count or resolution. In fact, I'm deliberately keeping them a bit more low res than they need to be, because I can always subdivide them later on or add in a couple of more edge loops where I need them. I occasionally had to switch out of Retopoflow mode to do things like flip the normals or move vertices back to the surface of the model when they ended up inside it somehow. The way Retopoflow is set up, you can't manipulate faces like that, which makes sense because obviously you don't want to be messing around with something that's on the back of your model. But outside of select situations like that, I could pretty much stay in Retopoflow mode the entire time. I continue working on my major loops, for example the ones around the neck and going around the back of the head, and one that goes around the eyes kind of like a mask. Like with most of my models, I pull up some references to get a better idea of what important loops are and where I should put them. At this point I'm pretty satisfied with all my basic loops, so I start filling in all the bits between them. I add in some extra loops where they're necessary, for example around the inside of the mouth or around the corner of the mouth, and otherwise just go around connecting things up, adding and removing edges and edge loops where needed, and making sure everything fits together neatly. Occasionally I run into a couple of things that I found a bit difficult, for example the nose. The overall nose has a very distinct shape, and I try to keep edge loops or at least edges around that shape, but there's also the nostril, so I have to have enough edges to make sure the nostril has a pretty decent shape. And it took me a while and a bit of trial and error to figure out something that worked for it. My eventual solution had a triangle in it, but that doesn't really matter since it's not in a spot where it's gonna disturb the deformation, and I'm going to triangulate everything later on anyway, because I need that for a normal map so that it works properly in all kinds of different engines. One relatively important thing while retopologizing is that all the faces are relatively even, meaning the sides are around about similar lengths and I don't have some really awkward angles there. Luckily, Retopoflow has a relax brush that works in places like this. If you aren't using Retopoflow or you run into some issues with the relax brush like I did at some point later, by default Blender also has the relax slide brush in sculpt mode, and if you hold shift while using that, you can also relax the topology. That worked a little bit more reliably, however that might affect the volume a bit, so if you're using it, make sure to add a shrink wrap modifier and apply it so that all your vertices are still sticking to the surface of your model. For the vast majority of the process here, I'm using the poly pen. There are technically other tools that can more quickly and easily add edge loops or even fill whole areas, but I found using the poly pen tool and maybe going over it with a relax brush once or twice later on is a lot more accurate and easier almost for me. With the face itself done, the next thing I do is the little tufts of fur around the side. I just extrude faces along the length of the strands of fur, and then make sure to add a big edge loop around the top of them where it's completely separate from the head, and I just fill in the tips with triangles. After that, the only thing left to do is fill in the couple of remaining spaces under the chin and at the back of the head, and with that the whole head is already done. This time the head retopology was way quicker than it was for my last model. In fact, the entire body, including clothes, took me less time than it did to retopologize the head on my last model. And that's for a couple of reasons. For one, Retopoflow sped things up a bit, and I didn't have nearly as much fur to worry about. But also, I had way less individual polys to arrange for this one, which makes sense obviously since the final result is also lower poly. However, in hindsight, I probably could have also just retopologized the last model in way more low poly than I did, and just subdivided it later on. I probably would still have to make some tweaks after subdividing it, but it still wouldn't have taken nearly as long as placing all the faces manually. But hey, looking back on old work and noticing all the mistakes or things you could have done differently is part of the learning process. And with the head done, it's time to move on to the body. Most of the torso is just one curvy cylinder, so I use the contours tool to quickly add edge loops around it. Next, I add loops under the boobs and connect them up. Unlike the face, the rest of the body doesn't really have many places where a bunch of loops in different directions are interacting, so I can pretty much connect them as soon as I've made them. Next, I go along the top of the boobs and decide on the topology around that. This part doesn't have this kind of clear curve like the bottom, so I made one top edge loop to close it off that follows the rest of the chest, and then added a bunch of closed circular loops inside of that to work well with a rounded shape. To fill in the middle, I decided to use a kind of grid of quads rather than a triangle fan, because having that many triangles converging at one point kind of causes a bit of weird shading sometimes. Just ignore the fact that I use UV spheres for the eyes. And now I do the arms. I pretty much just use the contours tool to super quickly add in the edges and then divide them up with some edge loops. For the lower arm, I twist the edge loop around the wrist before adding in the edge loops so that the hand can turn all the way around without it causing too much weird deformation. I also add in a bit of extra topology around the elbow, just to allow that to deform nicely too. I could have also just added in a couple of extra edge loops, but I kind of like these fancy little patches. And now for the legs. I pretty much do them the exact same way I did the arms, just minus the twisty bit around the bottom. I prefer having the arms and the legs done before I do the hips and the shoulders, because obviously that's where everything connects together, and it's a lot easier to make a connection point when you actually have the things that you want to connect together. Just like the elbows, the knees also get a little patch, but this time I do them in edit mode because that way I can use the inset tool, which is quite a bit faster than manually making the loops. Next, I do the feet. I use the contours tool again to add some topology, leaving a bit of a gap so I can manually figure out the ankle. It isn't anything particularly complicated, just the contours tool wouldn't have quite been able to do it. And now it's time for the next thing, the tail. Again, I use the contours tool to add in some edge loops around it. Like I mentioned in the last video on the sculpting process, I'm not going to be paying any extra attention to outline all the individual tufts of fur. I deliberately sculpted them relatively flat to the body, so all the extra detail is going to come in with a normal map. Since the tail is very thin at the base and gets thicker and more detailed around the mouth, I also need the amount of edge loops to increase. For that, I use triangles to slowly add in more and more edges. Now that I have the topology for the torso, the upper legs, and the base of the tail in place, I can slowly fill in the area around the waist. The front was relatively straightforward, I just had to connect everything up and fill it in. Then I added in one long loop in between the legs, going up all the way to the base of the tail. Now for the butt cheeks. Technically, I could have just taken the topology I already had from the waist and the legs and connect them together. However, then I would have ended up with some pretty big faces, and you would have definitely noticed some weird sharp edges when looking at it from certain angles, which obviously isn't something you want. But I eventually ended up with something that worked without having too much stretching, but also still keeping the edge loops flowing in somewhat sensible directions. Now the topology is pretty good as is, but it could still use an edge loop or two just to make the deformation a bit better. So I add those in. I also want an extra loop around the tail, so I go into edit mode and use the bevel tool to add it in. At this point, the body topology is really starting to take shape. But before I start working on the next little piece, I go around it and make a couple of tweaks here and there, adding in some more edge loops and relaxing the topology. And now for the hands. I use the contours tool to add a big cylinder for each finger. Then I add in 3 extra loops for each joint. I also add in some extra loops in between the joints just to allow for a bit of variation in thickness. I also fill in the tips with 4 faces each, but I end up changing that up a bit later. I pretty much repeat the same process for the thumb, though unlike the other fingers with 8, it has 10 loops around. Next, I add in a loop around the rounded part at the base of the thumb. Then I start subdividing it a bit, adding some more edges in between, and then I connect it to the thumb itself. This was actually surprisingly hard, because at some points it's directly connected to the base of the thumb, and at other parts it's quite far away, so I had to find a way to add more faces to the places that needed it, without making a bunch of awkward pulls or routing the topology in a weird direction. I eventually end up with something I'm relatively happy with, so I move on to the next step, connecting up the fingers and everything. I fill in 2 faces between each finger and subdivide it a bit, and I take special care to make sure that all the fingers are connected at the same spot, so that they all have the same amount of geometry at the front and back. Once I've filled in the faces directly in between the fingers, I extrude some bits out and add in a bit of extra geometry so I, again, don't get that much stretching or anything like that. Now I have one clear edge going all the way around all the fingers, so I pull that out a bit more and add in one big, nice face loop going all the way around. At this point I noticed that I actually ended up adding too much geometry around the base of the fingers, so I reduce it down a bit and make the faces a bit wider. I also redo the tips of the fingers to make sure I have one face loop going all the way around the entire hand across all the fingertips. That isn't necessary for good deformation or anything, but it's nice to have later on when I'm doing something like UV unwrapping, so that I can just easily select an entire loop going around the whole hand without having to manually go around and select all kinds of individual little bits. Now with all the fingers in place, I just need to connect everything up. Though that is a lot harder than it sounds. The back of the hand is fairly straightforward because you have a lot of space where you can just add in a basic grid. But in the front you have the rounded part of the thumb, as well as the straight edge under the fingers, and you have to find a way to connect all of that together without ruining any part of the topology. At this point I also ran into some issues with the relax brush. I don't know why exactly, but it started really messing with the topology and like throwing it out in all kinds of directions. So when I needed to smooth stuff out, I ended up using the relax brush in sculpt mode. As I said earlier, that worked a little bit more reliably. Sadly, I lost the footage for the last bit of the hand. I must have forgotten to press record or something like that. But really, I just spent the rest of the time filling in, as I said, the grid for the back of the hand, and then like finagling around to try and connect everything up in front too. Either way, once it was done and connected up to the arm, I knew that I had my hand topology and resolution set in stone, so it was time to connect everything up to the shoulder. Again, this was surprisingly complicated because there were a couple of important loops I wanted to maintain and a couple of shapes that needed a bit of like specific geometry. I wanted to have edges that went across the entire collarbone, I wanted edge loops that went around the arm where it started, and I wanted an edge loop going around the shoulder. And I had to somehow find a way to get all of those in place and connect it up without getting some like awkward stretching or like individual polygons that were either too big or too long. And yeah, that whole mess took a while to organize. I often forget how complicated shoulders can be to connect up, but there's quite a lot of stuff going on in that area. There's the neck connecting into the body, there's the collarbone as I mentioned, there's obviously the arm itself coming out, there's also boobs on some characters, and in addition to that, it's a quite important part of the character's topology because obviously shoulders need to be able to move around a lot. They need to be able to like move up and down, back and forth, and the arm itself also needs to be able to move around, forward, backwards, up and down, without getting too much awkward stretching and stuff, and that always requires a bit of a very neat, tidy topology that deforms well. I end up figuring out the topology with a couple of triangles, and they're all pretty much on the chest rather than in the shoulder itself, so they aren't gonna like cause problems with the deformation or anything. Now the main body is really nearing completion. The only things I have left to do is the tail and the paws, starting with the paws. I separate out a bit of geometry around the feet so that I don't have everything active and getting in my way while I'm working. The first thing I do is add a bit more geometry to the feet, but I eventually decide to undo it and just start on the paws separately and then connect them up later. I make one edge in between all the toes and a couple more on top of the toes so that they have their rounded shape and don't have any visible sharp edges from a normal viewing angle. The geometry at the front of the toes is relatively straightforward, it's just a bunch of edge loops going around all the toes, and then at the sides I wrap it around, connecting right up to the top, and add in a quick pull just to close it all off. The geometry at the bottom gets a bit more complicated. I extrude one face loop all the way along the bottom edge, and then start working to fill in all the geometry of the paw pads. At first I considered kind of individually retopologizing all of them with like circular topology, but I decided that's a bit overkill for the bottom of the feet, so I just made sure I kind of had edges inside each of the creases, and then I just went over everything with relatively even topology. This doesn't look particularly good or paw pad-like with smooth shading on, but since I'm going to be baking a normal map for this and adding in all the extra detail there, it's going to turn out looking fine. Now the topology of the paws is done, and I just need to connect it up to the rest of the legs. But obviously the paws have a lot more geometry than the rest of the feet, so I have to decide on how and where I'm gonna narrow that down. Eventually I decide to subdivide the whole rest of the foot, and then I use some diamonds to reroute the topology and reduce the geometry towards the top. Finally, I join the feet back with the rest of the body, merge by distance to make sure I don't have any double vertices, and the feet are done. And after adding a bit more geometry to the inside of the mouth, it's time to do the last part of the main body, the tailmaw. Unlike the rest of the tail, the area around the mouth has a bunch of fur that actually sticks out from the mesh, so I have to retopologize all of that individually. I follow around about the same process for all the tufts of fur. I follow the same general process for each tuft of fur. I make sure my geometry flows in the same direction as the fur, I make sure I have edges in the creases in between each tuft, and I make sure I have one edge loop going all the way around any bits that stick out fully from the rest of the mesh. I also make sure my loops around the tips are closed loops, meaning they go all the way around and then end up exactly where they started, so they essentially form a ring. For the few extra tufts of fur that go around the top that don't quite stick out fully, I don't make a ring around the top, but I do make sure they have an edge loop going all the way around them so that they have a decent amount of thickness and geometry to separate them from the rest of everything that's just laying flat. Anyway, back to the hairs that stick out along the edge of the mouth. Once I've made the closed loop going all the way around them, I extrude that out until I reach around about the tip, and then I fill that with a bunch of triangles. I look at it from different angles to make sure the tip of the triangles matches up with the tip on the high poly sculpt. Of course, it can't quite fit 100% exactly because the sculpt is a bit more rounded, but as long as it's roughly in the right position, it works. In places like this, with a bunch of detailed bits like the hair, I'm not quite as concerned about the overall topology. My main concern is that all the little details, in this case the hairs, have the proper geometry to support their shape. That being said, I do try and make sure that my overall topology is relatively even, and that when I have major loops that don't directly support a bit like the hair, that they still flow in a relatively reasonable direction. I'm starting to notice at this point that I'm gonna need a bit more geometry towards the end of the tail, so I go into edit mode and use Ctrl B to use the bevel tool to make some extra edge loops so I have a bit more to connect. And then I go on right away and connect the top jaw to the rest of the tail. And then I start on the bottom jaw. I separate this one out into a separate object because all the other geometry from the top jaw and the rest of the tail was starting to get in my way a bit. The process for this part is exactly the same as for the top though. I make my geometry follow the shape of the fur, I make sure I have closed loops around all the tips, and I fill in the very top with triangles. And now the bottom jaw is pretty much done. I just need to connect it up with the rest and fill in the little remaining gaps. There are a couple of little finicky bits of hair in the corner of the mouth that I left for last because they needed all the geometry in place, so I knew how to connect them up. But in general, I use the exact same process for them as I did for the rest of the fur. Next, I connect up the geometry of the bottom jaw to the rest of the tail and add in a couple of more edge loops where they're needed. I use the bevel tool again with Ctrl B for some of them, and also the knife tool for others. I end all my extra loops with triangles rather than taking them way up the tail, because they would just get in my way there and the model doesn't need any extra geometry further up. Once everything's connected up, I just fill in the rest of the inside of the mouth. That's relatively straightforward. I just fill it in with a very basic grid that I just connect however it kind of fits. The topology in here doesn't have to be perfect. It can have some longer quads or some triangles or whatever, since it doesn't really need to deform much and you aren't going to be able to see it much anyway. And with that done and the tail connected back to the body is fully retopologized. But before I move on to the claws and hair and clothes, I decided to do a test bake. So I used Smart UV Project to quickly project a UV map, and then tried to bake a normal map. It took quite a few attempts. At first I had just an 8-bit image instead of a 32-bit image, so it didn't work well. Then I had the ray distance wrong, and when I got that fixed, I realized that I was still trying to bake from the decimated mesh, which ended up with a slightly weird normal map. But with a 32-bit image and the proper high poly mesh, I ended up with this pretty good bake. With this test bake done, I can be relatively sure that my topology works fine with my underlying high poly mesh and I won't run into major issues later on while baking. So I can comfortably move on to working on the rest of the model. I start with the nails. They don't really need retopology in the typical sense, because for one, I'm not going to be baking them so they don't have to stick super closely to the high poly version. And two, they already have a pretty good geometry, I just need to reduce the amount of edge loops a little bit. So for both the hands and the feet, I just select a bunch of edge loops, press X and dissolve edge loops, and also use the edge slide to slide some of the edges into each other. For that, I also have to make sure auto merge is on so I don't just have a bunch of vertices sitting right on top of each other. Next, I do the tongue on the Tailmaw. I had thought I could just do the same process with this one as I did for the nails, but turns out I had remeshed it at some point, so I just used Retopoflow again to retopologize it. That was super quick because I could really just use the contours tool and just had to add 1 or 2 extra loops here and there. Next, I do the teeth. For them, I could use the same approach as I did for the nails, because they do already have their good topology. So I just applied all the modifiers they had on them except for the mirror modifier, delete some faces, specifically the ones at the top because I don't really need them, and then slide some edges into each other to reduce the amount of edge loops I have. I really didn't need to do much for the teeth since they are already quite low poly, and like the nails, I'm not going to be baking any normal maps for them, their smooth shading is fine, so they also don't need to stick super close to the high poly version. Next, I move up to the face. The eyes are fine as they are, so I just remove the subdivision surface modifier. And next I do the inside of the mouth, starting with the tongue. Since I made that with a skin modifier and never remeshed it, it already has pretty good basic topology, so I just duplicate it, delete one side to add a mirror modifier, and reduce the topology down a bit. Unlike the nails and the teeth, the tongue here is actually going to be baked, so I add a shrink wrap modifier to it, set to the high poly tongue, to make sure that everything's stuck really close together so I can get a good normal map out of it. And now for the teeth. Like I mentioned in the last video, I'm not quite happy with how they look, so I mess around with sculpt mode for a bit to see if I can kind of fix them. I'm still not quite happy with where I ended up, but for now I'll retopologize them and I'll figure something out later. I start by only adding geometry for the outside of the teeth. Then I add and apply a solidify modifier and can use the resulting geometry to do the inside. Then I go in and add some more edge loops, adjust the position of the different vertices, and just make sure it works with the shape of the teeth and has enough geometry. I use Retopoflow for part of the process here, but I do a lot of it in just regular old edit mode too, because that's a bit easier to use for stuff where you want to extrude and stuff like that. Anyway, eventually I end up with pretty decent topology for the top teeth. But as I mentioned, I'm still not quite happy with a high poly model, and I'm gonna bake them, so I need that to look good. I eventually decide to duplicate the low poly version and add a multi-res modifier and use that to sculpt in the detail again. And that turns out a lot nicer in my opinion than the original high poly sculpt did. Finally, I adjust the low poly version just a little bit to make sure it fits the new high poly version, and then I can move on to the bottom teeth. Since my approach for the top teeth was successful, I repeat the same process for the bottom teeth, retopologizing them using a solidify modifier, then duplicating them and using multi-res to fix the issues I had had with the original shape. And now the eyelashes and eyebrows. Since I originally just made them low poly with a solidify modifier and a subdivision surface modifier, I can pretty much just remove them and the geometry is fine as is. And now there's just one last thing left to do before I move on to the clothes. The hair. I use Ctrl A and visual geometry to mesh to make the curve hair into mesh. That way I can decimate and otherwise edit it to make the low poly version. I also went around filling in the ends, which in hindsight was entirely unnecessary, and in fact actually caused a couple of problems. Anyway, I turned on wireframe in the overlays and added a decimate modifier to all the hairs, and then set the decimate modifier to unsubdivide and turned up the iterations. When you have it set to odd numbers, it kind of causes some weird pinching and makes all your edges diagonal, but as long as it's an even number, it works fine, and you can set it as high as you need to decimate the model. In this case I set it up to I think 4 or 6, and that was good enough for the horizontal edge loops. However, there were still a bit too many vertical ones, so I manually in edit mode just selected them and dissolved them. I didn't want to reduce the resolution too much at first. I was afraid like maybe the shape wouldn't come through as well, but I ended up actually coming back later on and removing a couple more just to keep my poly count nice and low. With the curve hairs done, I move on to the base I had sculpted. As I mentioned in the first video, I used multi-resolution for it, so that I wouldn't have to go through the effort of retopologizing. So all I had to do was duplicate it and remove the multi-resolution modifier, and I was pretty much done. I could do pretty much the exact same thing for the hair in the front, though in this case I added a couple extra edges just to make sure it holds the shape a bit better. And finally, I do the curve hairs in the front. I do them pretty much exactly the same way I did the ones in the back, using the decimate modifier to get the resolution fairly low, deleting the tips, and reducing the amount of vertical edge loops a bit more in edit mode. Next, I do the little tufts of fur inside her ears. They're again made with multi-resolution, so I just have to duplicate them and remove the multi-resolution modifier in one of them. In this case, I split the object into several objects so that I can apply a shrink wrap modifier to them without it getting super messed up. And with that, the character herself is done, and it's time to do the clothes. But before I properly start, I organize everything into separate collections and hide parts so they don't get in my way. I also quickly reduce the resolution of her earring. I just select a couple of edge loops and delete them. Now for the retopology of the clothes themselves. I decided to start with the jeans because that seemed like the easiest part, because I can mostly just reuse the topology of the body. For that, I select the part of the body mesh that's under the jeans, duplicate it with Shift-D and use P to separate it into a new object. Then I can use Alt-S to inflate the new geometry so it goes out over the trousers, and add a shrink wrap modifier to make sure it actually sticks to the surface. With that, the basic topology is already done, and I just have to go around making some tweaks. For example, for the jeans, I don't want them to have a hole where the tail comes out. And down at the bottom of the jeans, I want my geometry to follow the shape of the folds. For that, I pretty much just use the knife tool to cut along the sharp edges of the folds and also in between them to make sure that the silhouette of the retopology is pretty much the same as the silhouette of the high poly sculpt. That way the wrinkles are gonna look nice even with most of the detail baked in just as a normal map. The jeans aren't 100% symmetrical, so once I'm done doing the retopology, I apply my mirror modifier and go around tweaking the stuff that doesn't quite work on both sides. I also add a solidify modifier to give them a bit of thickness, especially around the bottom. I then also apply the solidify modifier and delete some interior faces that accidentally formed. Then I go around the edges, especially the bottom, and make sure that the new vertices formed by the solidify modifier are sitting nicely on the surface of the high poly sculpt rather than overlapping with it in some kind of weird way. Now you might notice with the solidify modifier applied, we have a whole bunch of extra unnecessary geometry that's just gonna add up to my poly count. So what I do is go into edit mode, select a whole bunch of stuff, and then make a new vertex group, and use that vertex group in a mask modifier. The mask modifier essentially is just a modifier that deletes stuff, just that it's non-destructive. So if later on I decide I do actually want a few more of those interior faces, I can always remove them from the vertex group, and when I'm done and have decided on which vertices I do and don't want, I can just apply the modifier and it'll delete them for me. Anyway, now it's time for the tank top. I again use some geometry from the main body as kind of a base to start working on the tank top itself. However, unlike the jeans, the tank top is actually quite different than the underlying body, so I have to make quite a few changes to the topology. But the process is really exactly the same as the process for the retopology of the body itself. I just go around with a poly pen, creating all the basic loops. In this case, they go around the waist, as well as around like the openings for the head and the arms. Then I go around filling in all the spaces in between the loops, making sure I don't have any awkward stretching or like visible edges and faces from the sides. And finally, once the basic shape is done, I apply my mirror modifier and go around adding in all the folds and wrinkles. Like I did with the jeans, I use the knife tool to cut out where I need extra geometry for the folds, as well as the move tool to just move the existing edge loops I have already to match up with the shape of the folds and wrinkles. Since I'm going to be baking a normal map, I don't need to make sure that every tiny detail is built into the low poly geometry. However, since a normal map only affects the surface, not the actual geometry, it's not going to affect the silhouette, so I do have to make sure that my low poly model has the right silhouette. Now with the topology done, it's time to add a solidify modifier again. I mess around with using the rim only setting, but I eventually decide against it and use the regular settings instead, and essentially follow the exact same technique that I used for the jeans. I select all the interior vertices I want gone, assign them to a vertex group, and use that for another mask modifier. And now, the last thing that needs retopology, the jacket. This is by far the hardest of all the clothes to retopologize, because it doesn't have the same geometry as the rest of the body at all, so I essentially have to completely just start over and make new geometry. That's made a bit difficult by the fact that obviously the sleeve is hollow, so some of the tools don't quite work the way one would expect. Also, any geometry that's stuck to the inside of the sleeve rather than the outside, I couldn't select or otherwise do anything with Retopoflow, because it doesn't really allow you to select or manipulate any object if there is some other face in between you and the vertex. Which obviously makes sense because you don't want to be messing around with the back of something while you're working on the front, but it's a bit difficult when the vertex accidentally ended up at the back and it's actually supposed to be at the front. So I have to keep going into edit mode and using surface snapping to get the vertices back to where I want them to be. But I figured out a workflow that worked for me and slowly went over the entire model, adding new topology over it. I pretty much followed the same approach I used for all the other parts of the model, figuring out the important edge loops and filling them in, and slowly increasing the resolution where needed. I also only did the outside of the jacket to begin with, so I could go in later on with a solidify modifier to save myself some time. That also meant that I had to do the collar from the bottom, which was a bit finicky, but otherwise I would have had to do either the entire rest of the jacket from the inside, or I would have had to connect something up awkwardly later on, and both of those options would have been more of a pain. to how I did with the body, I retopologized the sleeves and the main body of the jacket separately, and then I had to figure out how to connect them. That was a bit complicated because the amount of edge loops didn't match perfectly, and I wanted one extra edge loop to go around the shoulder. But after a bit of trial and error, I figured something out. Now with the overall topology done, it's time to figure out all the smaller details. Since the folds and wrinkles and all that aren't perfectly symmetrical, I apply the mirror modifier and start going around adding the proper topology to all the details. Like I did with the other clothes, I work on moving my topology and edge flow to match the flow of the folds and wrinkles on the sleeves. For that, I both move my existing topology around and use the knife tool to cut new edges where they're needed. You'll probably notice that I have a whole bunch of triangles in my topology here, but as I mentioned earlier, that doesn't matter because in order to bake this mesh, I'm gonna have to triangulate it anyway. And in this situation, I like to have the extra bit of control over which direction any given quad is sliced in the triangulation process. Once I'm happy with all the folds and wrinkles on the one side, I go on and repeat the same process with the folds on the other side. Like I mentioned earlier, I couldn't just use a mirror modifier to mirror over my topology because the sculpt wasn't perfectly symmetrical. With both sleeves done, I move back to the main body of the jacket to add some more detail there. I use the knife tool again to cut up the topology in the back to match the shape of the folds, not really changing the actual topology, just pre-deciding how it's gonna be triangulated later. Now I go over to the pockets. At first I considered just leaving the topology as was and having the main detail baked in with a normal map, but I was concerned that the angle would be a bit too sharp, so I added a couple more edges so that I could be sure that the bake and everything would work properly. I also tweaked the geometry for some of the folds around the chest a bit more. I probably didn't have to follow all the folds and stuff as closely as I did for the retopology, but I don't have a whole lot of experience and I still need to mess around and try stuff out to figure out how much I do and don't need. In this case, I didn't want to lose out on any detail because the model should be useful for other things besides just VRchat. This model is almost done now. I just need to make a couple more tweaks to the collar before I can apply the solidify modifier and finish it up. I did a bit of tweaking and rerouting so that the topology can deform properly, and instead of redoing everything on the other side, I just duplicated it and flipped it over, and then carefully made sure that any double vertices got merged together properly. And with that done, it's time to apply the solidify modifier, and directly after that I add and apply a shrink wrap modifier to make sure my topology is properly stuck to both sides of the model. Now I go around in edit mode a bit and make some tweaks here and there so that the topology properly fits, especially around the collar where you actually see the inside topology. And finally I add in another mask modifier to mask the unnecessary topology on the inside of the jacket. Now, with all the topology done, you might notice that I've actually gone over my poly limit a little bit. And to fix that, I go into the body and add a mask modifier to mask out any topology that's hidden by layers of clothing. That keeps my poly count down, which is good, and it also prevents any clipping from happening during animation because there are 2 levels of mesh on top of each other. Off camera, I actually do the same for the tank top. And now, with a couple more tweaks and fixes, the retopology is complete. And here's how it ended up. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I've really improved my process a lot since my last retopology, which is really nice. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, this entire process took less time than just the retopology of the face on the last character I did. And I'm hoping that I'll continue to improve and speed up as I make more 3D models in the future. I hope you guys also learned something from this video. Even if you don't use Retopoflow, the process is pretty much the same with default Blender. There are just a couple of things that are a bit slower. If you've enjoyed the process so far, definitely stick around and subscribe. In the next video next week, I'll be showing you how I made the rig. Anyway, that's all from me for now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and have a nice day. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that, and maybe check out one of my other videos to the right. If you'd like to see more of my art or maybe get a commission from me, I've put links to all that in the description below. And I've also put a link to the Discord server. Anyway, I hope you have a nice day and see you all next time.